William E. Colby, former director of the Central Intelligence Agency. How will the intelligence community react to the recent conviction of Admiral John Poindexter, former National Security Advisor, in connection with the Iran-Contra affair?
I don't think it'll react very much more than it has over the last 15 years of having to adjust to the fact that intelligence is not conducted only by the President, but has to be shared with the Congress's committees on intelligence.
Good evening. We're very pleased to have with us William Colby, former director of the CIA. We'll be talking about the recent convictions of John Poindexter and other members of the Reagan administration involved in the Iran-Contra affair. If you have questions or comments, we'll be taking your phone calls in just a few minutes. The number to call, as always, if you're watching us from the Eastern or Central time zones, 202-628-2525. If you're watching us in the Pacific or Mountain time zones, the number to call there, 202-783-2727. And if you're watching C-SPAN from outside the United States, our numbers are open for international lines as well. The number's on your screen. First of all, Mr. Colby, you were with the CIA for how many
25 years.
During your 25 years, how have you seen the intelligence process evolve?
Well, when I started, intelligence essentially took the myths and the traditions of the old tiny little spy service at the knee of a president or a king or whatever. During that time, our intelligence system increased in size and importance thanks to the new methods of collecting intelligence, the new methods of analyzing it, to a very major institution which could not be handled in the same way as a tiny little spy service. And I think this was the main change. Sooner or later, we had to adjust it, just as sooner or later we had to put up a sign in front of the agency on the Parkway that this was really CIA, although we'd pretended it hadn't, that great big building hadn't been there for years, although every pilot used it as a checkpoint on his way up the Potomac, turn left at CIA. You know, these old traditions were inherent in intelligence for centuries. We have created a new kind of intelligence, and that's the thing we've had to adjust. It's bigger, it's more important, and most of all, it has to operate under our Constitution rather than outside it.
When you first heard of the so-called Iran-Contra affair, selling missiles and equipment to Iran and then the money going to the Contras, what was your reaction?
Well, you have to very carefully separate the details of that story. It's not just one story, it's two separate stories, and it was handled in two separate ways. The missiles sent over to the Iranians for our hostages was handled as a normal covert operation, beginning with the President and with some of his assistants, worked through the CIA. The CIA prepared a presidential finding, which is required in the law, that it be authorized to go ahead and do this, sent it up to the White House, expecting that it would be, as normally, passed over to the Congress in a timely fashion, as the law required. The White House decided not to pass it over for some 10 months, which is hardly timely. The other part of the Iran-Contra was taking the money off the edge and sending it to the Iran-Contra, to the Contras in Nicaragua. Now that was against a direct congressional directive which said that no one engaged in intelligence can send aid to the Contras. And the CIA essentially stayed out of that one. And Colonel North worked it through his independent connections. The CIA had very little connection with that one. There were a couple of fellows who stepped over the edge, no question about it, and they have been punished. But other than that, the agency was not so much in the Contra side of the operation. What it was in the missile, the Iran side of it, and that it was conducting in the normal way that it conducts things, but the White House decided not to send the information to the Congress as would have been required.
Are there situations when a president feels that he cannot afford to compromise an activity by making it known to the Congress? And
there have been in the past, but the law is very clear now that that's not permissible. When that law was passed in 1974, I stopped in at the White House and said that we just couldn't work that way anymore.
Were you ever asked, as when you were during the time that you were a director, or when you were a more junior member of the CIA, to conduct some operation without notifying Congress?
Oh, I think the normal situation was not to notify Congress. There was very little curiosity on the part of the congressmen and senators. The respected senators said they didn't want to know. They had no desire. We would once in a while go up and brief some of the senior leadership, but that's all.
When you look at the world today, with all the changes in Eastern Europe, we no longer have a Berlin Wall, which was certainly up when you were director. Sure. Do you have a sense now that there's no longer the great urgency, the great need for the level of intelligence that has been in place for so many years?
Well, we're going to have to keep our powder dry, in the old colonial expression. We're going to have to keep a watch to see that all these things are really developing that way. Obviously, if we can get information openly, we don't have to seek it secretly. But nonetheless, we're going to have to verify that other nations are actually following the arms control agreements that we make, and that's going to require the satellites and the photographs and things like that to check that the numbers are actually within the treaty limits. We are still going to have a major job of penetrating into terrorist groups, into the drug lords, various of these other people that create trouble for our citizens and for our allies around the world.
When you look at the Central American region, do you anticipate that there's going to be a need in the future, particularly in places like Nicaragua, for covert activity?
It's hard to tell. I think we have the institutions now to do some kind of assistance openly that we used to have to do covertly because there was no other way to do it. We have the National Endowment for Democracy that gave assistance to the Nicaraguan elections and helped to keep them honest. Now, that would have been a chore given to CIA 20 years ago, but now we have this new institution that does it openly, so CIA does not have to do it secretly.
You described earlier the process as it used to be, particularly the mechanism of a presidential finding. Is that an adequate mechanism, and can you explain to us how it works?
I think it's adequate if it's followed. If it's violated, it's like any other law that's violated. People are going to get punished for violating it. But the process is that if somebody wants the agency to conduct a covert operation, then a piece of paper has to be prepared called a presidential finding that that particular operation is important to our national security. And that has to be signed by the president himself, so he takes full responsibility. Then the Congress has to be told of the operation in a timely fashion. And there was an argument about how timely 10 months was, and they've now made a deal between the Congress and the executive that that will be really timely in the future. Now, the Congress doesn't have to approve it, but if it disapproves, it can make its views known, and it can even stop it, as it has stopped some in the past. So that ensures that the Congress is consulted and knows what's going on and has a chance to object if they feel that that's desirable.
I believe one of the counts that former National Security Advisor John Poindexter was charged with and ultimately convicted with had to do with covering up certain elements of the Iran-Contra affair. And in particular, I believe his actions where he tore up the presidential finding. What was your reaction when you heard about the allegation?
Destroying a document of considerable importance signed by the president. There are various laws and rules about that, but you're not allowed to do it.
Do you expect any of the rules will change in the aftermath of all this?
No, I think the rules are being applied. That's what's happening.
In case you've just joined us, we're visiting with former Central Intelligence Director William E. Colby. If you have a question or a comment, the numbers are on the screen. Well, let's go to a call. We've got a caller standing by in Beverly Hills. How are you, Beverly Hills? Go right ahead.
Good. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
I'm writing a book about Mr. Colby, in fact, concerning Lawrence E. King. Additionally, about the Union Hand Bank. What I'm trying to get around to is the limitations or lack of them concerning money banking. Edwin Meese proved a good example of a rogue operator, but it seems that there has been no limitations on the banking of the CIA, externally or internally. Viewing Panama was, of course, the money laundering capital of our hemisphere. Do you believe that there should be some provisions by Congress or self-regulations within the CIA whereby we don't have a repeat of the Noonien Hand Bank or the Pete Bruton articles?
Well, we have very serious restrictions within CIA and have long had them. We have a separate audit staff. We have the requirement for signed receipts for money that's handled. Even those receipts remain secret. They have to be signed. I've handled a lot of money in my time and been under very, very tight restriction, including having a polygraph after I had handled a certain amount of money to find out whether I really had handled it the way I should have. No, I think you'll find that the CIA's controls of money are as tight or even tighter than most other government agencies.
Before we go back to the phones, could you tell us in a nutshell how the CIA budget is developed and where it sits in relation to the overall defense budget?
Well, it's like any other government department. The preparation of the budget begins within the CIA. They add up the different elements that they think they're going to need for the next year. They prepare it into a document. They submit it to the Bureau of the Budget. It reviews it, cuts it out, moves it perhaps, or disapproves some things. The President finally gets a look at the budget and decides whether that makes sense to him. And then it goes up to the Congress. Now, the CIA budget just goes to the two congressional committees dealing with intelligence, one in the House and one in the Senate. And they pull it apart and look at every line item. How much are you spending in country X? What are you spending it for? Why can't you get along with less? Why do you need that big new piece of machinery up in the sky? They ask all those kinds of questions in the same way that they do over the defense budget or anything else. Then the committee approves it, recommends to the Congress that it be approved, and it is approved. It's not made public, however.
Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, thanks for waiting. Go right ahead.
Yes, Mr. Colby.
Yes, sir.
You once wrote a book about the Phoenix Project in Vietnam. Is that book still in circulation?
Yes, it just came out recently. It's called Lost Victory.
No, about the Phoenix Project.
Well, it covers the Phoenix Project.
And also, are there any black CIA agents?
Are there? Yes, there are. A number of them.
Did you have any working for you in Vietnam?
Pardon?
Did you have any working for you in Vietnam?
Yes, we had several working there, and actually one of our black agents was killed in a neighboring country in a helicopter crash. I went to his funeral.
Thanks for the call. You've also written a book called Honorable Men. What was that about?
That was about the CIA and my life in it, from parachuting in World War II on to being director.
Why did you decide to join the CIA?
Well, it was during World War II, and I was a parachute officer in the parachute artillery, and people came down recruiting for people to go jump into France and work with the resistance forces there. And since I had stayed in France one summer during the late 1930s and had learned a little French, I thought that was a rather more interesting way to fight the war than in the parachute artillery.
You spent 25 years with the agency?
With the agency in total, yes.
Let's go back to the phones. Portland, Oregon. Nice to hear from you. Go ahead.
Hi. Good evening, gentlemen. Mr. Colby.
Yes, sir.
This is about the general, apparently psycho-intellectual or some other kind of incompetence of Americans to deal with human intelligence sources. And apparently from the same source, the desire to, depend on satellites and airplanes and that kind of thing. We both know that, and it is so hilarious that the CIA actually was calling up for detectives from New York City to play the, or kind of work in anti-terrorism. And what I find interesting about you and your crew and your general, and may I say that the CIA, of course, 80% of its work is general academic stuff. And you can go and buy it from the government printing office, and it's very elegant work is done. But somehow, at the end of things, Americans, at least as run by the CIA, don't seem to be really very good at just simply going to places and talking to people, and if necessary, taking certain kinds of side turns. And that's all that is about. And I was just wondering, you personally, and I've read your book about Vietnam, and I understand that, and that was absolutely true. I mean, I was there, and...
All right, caller, may we have your question, please?
Well, I think...
Why are Americans incompetent at handling human intelligence sources?
All right.
Well, I don't
Thanks
think
for calling.
that's necessarily true. Of course, there have been some mistakes made and some grievous mistakes made with handling people in various times in history. But yes, Americans are more interested in technology generally, do spend an awful lot of our effort on satellite photography and things like that, which have improved intelligence immensely in these last 20-odd years. We now get things from the technology that we couldn't possibly get from an individual. But there are good people and bad people in any large group of people. We select our case officers very carefully. We train them. And I think that if you'll go around the world, you'll find a lot of people who think very highly of the officers that they worked with in the CIA.
Mr. Colby, how would you describe the CIA's efforts in Iran, I guess during the years that you were director, and then were you still director when the Shah was
No, I was not.
removed? How would you describe the intelligence gathering operations in Iran?
Well, we had various things. We had people there who worked on targets in the Soviet Union with the approval of the Iranian authorities, and those were very valuable to us because we had an access from there that could not be matched anywhere else. It was really very effective and very helpful. We spent a certain amount of our time looking at what the situation was in Iran itself, at what kind of opposition was developing to the chief of state. We ran a psychological assessment of the Shah to see what kind of a fellow he was. It turned out that we believed that he was not a very strong man, and that if he came under a lot of pressure, he might yield to it. We looked at these various things. We worked with the authorities there, of course, because you can't live in a country without working with the authorities there. But the idea that we depended totally on the Iranian authorities for our assessment of what was going on in Iran is baloney. We never do that. We look on our own. We develop our own independent sources in any situation.
You've worked with a number of American embassies around the world. What countries have you worked in?
I worked in Stockholm in Sweden and in Rome and then in Saigon in Vietnam.
Is it difficult for the intelligence community to maintain an objective view of what's going on in a country, be it Iran or Nicaragua or anywhere else, if they get too close to the situation?
No, I think they can be independent, making an independent assessment. And one of the things we do is we separate our operators who live in the country from our analysts who review the material that the operators produce, with the idea that the analysts can be a bit more objective and be a little separate from the hue and cry of what's going on in the country. That's one of the techniques we use to try to get objectivity and impartiality into our assessments.
Lombard, Illinois, thanks for calling. Nice to hear from you. Go ahead.
Hello, gentlemen. Mr. Colby, I'm glad to talk to a fellow airborne redleg.
Attaboy. Thank you.
Secondly, on a less congenial subject, I'm kind of concerned about your involvement and other ex-agents' involvement in firearms control. You know, obviously in Eastern Europe and in Red China recently, we have seen the results of a lack of private ownership of firearms and what it can do to democracy. I was wondering what exactly brought you to support that type of legislation. Thank you.
Right. Well, I'm the fellow who handed out 500,000 weapons to Vietnamese villagers so that they could defend themselves. So I certainly understand the value of having weapons in the hands of people when they're faced with a threat, with a danger, and that when they can associate with each other to protect themselves against it. But in those 500,000, I did not include one pistol, because pistols are dangerous, more to the holders than to the others. Rifles are very effective defensive weapons for a group of people defending their community. And so I make the distinction between the handgun and the defense, the kind of militia that our forefathers were talking about when they wanted to protect their right to hold a gun in their country home to help protect their society.
Mr. Colby, I want to go back to the Poindexter conviction, and let me read you an excerpt from Associated Press's wire copy from the other day talking about that conviction and get your reaction to this. They said Poindexter's conspiracy conviction on Saturday was the first courtroom confirmation that Poindexter, North, the late CIA Director William Casey, National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane, and others worked illegally together. You're a former director, as we all know. I'm wondering what reaction you have to that conviction that a former CIA director worked illegally to, I guess, circumvent the law.
Well, Bill Casey was not on trial. Of course, he's dead and could not be. They meant first courtroom conviction. The other gentleman you mentioned largely pled guilty. They accepted it. Colonel North was only convicted on some rather peripheral elements and not the central points that he was indicted for. So what Bill Casey did and when he did it is really still lost in the shrouds of history. I don't think there's a clear answer to that.
Did you know him well?
I didn't know him very well. I knew him as a friend. He was a dedicated man for his country, that's for sure.
Kansas City, Missouri. Thanks for calling. Go ahead.
Is it true that the CIA has ever spied anyone in the United States?
Has ever what, sir?
Spied on anyone in the United States?
In the 1950s and 60s, the CIA participated in several activities that were launched by the government to try to keep a watch on what were thought of as subversives or dangerous people. Among the things they did was bug some people who were former employees of the CIA that they had believed were in touch with foreign intelligence agencies. They also entered a few of the houses of similar people, either employees or former employees. They read some air mail between the Soviet Union and the United States, looking for contacts between agents in the Soviet Union and their people in the United States. So the answer is yes, there have been some occasions, but as I said in my full accounting of this 14 years ago, they were few and far between.
Mr. Casey, what is the historical, excuse me, Mr. Colby, what is the historical reason for drawing the line at the borders of the United States for the jurisdiction of the CIA?
Well, I think it makes a lot of sense. The CIA is trained in intelligence gathering. It's not trained in police activity. Police activity takes place in the United States and is only authorized where there is a violation of law or probable cause to believe that there's a violation of law. Then the police has to operate under such constitutional restraints as the Miranda warning and things of this nature, which you don't have to have outside. Rather interestingly, we have applied the protection of American citizens against intrusion by their government, even when the American citizen is abroad. If CIA wants to put a bug on somebody's phone in some faraway capital on the other part of the world, and he happens to be an American, they have to go to a court here to get a warrant, just as the FBI has to go here in the United States to get a warrant.
Tempe, Arizona, what's your question or comment?
I want to ask Mr. Colby if he's ever read the Costello book about the British Secret Service.
No, I'm afraid I have not read that one.
Oh, my goodness. You ought to read that one, Mr. Colby.
Thank you for the tip.
Did you have a question for us?
No, I just, if he hasn't read that book, I can't.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the call. How does our intelligence compare to that of the British and other
Well,
foreign
we live in a different country. I mean, we have a worldwide requirement to face up to the problems of nuclear missiles aimed intercontinentally at us, so we have to find out where those missiles are and what kinds of missiles they are. The British do not have the same kind of requirement. The British do very well at certain things. Other things they don't do well. We select our people for intelligence very, very carefully, insist that they have a full background investigation, psychological tests, all the other things. In Britain, for a long time, if you went to the right university, You went into the intelligence business without any questions asked, and that's how they got some very bad penetrations by the Soviet Union into the British intelligence service.
Former CIA Director William Colby is our guest. Let's go back to the phone. St. Louis, thanks for standing by. Go ahead.
Yes, I understand that a lot of the activities that went on in Vietnam are still classified, and I would like to know what the purpose of this is after all these years, and when a lot of these activities will become unclassified.
I don't think very many are still classified. There may be some, but certainly the ones that I was responsible for, we really didn't classify at all, or classified at a very low level so that they hardly counted. There may have been some agents, for instance, who worked for us on the communist side. I would still want to protect the names of those people who helped us out, because they could be subjected to considerable retribution if their names came out now.
We are looking at the headline of the Los Angeles Times, which reads, Poindexter convicted on 5 cover-up charges. This goes on in great length, as most of the major front pages around the country this week have done, to talk about the case in some detail. I was curious to know what this means in terms of the relationship between national security advisors and the CIA directors and the intelligence community from henceforth.
Well, I think they'll be very meticulous about being sure that what they do is properly reported, that what they do is properly within the law, that there is justification for each action they take. It may make them a little more cautious, and sometimes that can make them too cautious. But nonetheless, I think that it's not going to make any major change in the relationships.
Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Go ahead.
Hi, Mr. Colby.
Hi.
I have a question here. As recently as 1989, Roy Godson's consortium seemed to concur that the chief intelligence target for the 1990s would still be the Soviet Union. And I've just been reading in, I guess, the winter issue of Foreign Policy that Joseph Nye doesn't exclude the possibility of a kind of neo-axis between a newly emerging Germany and the economic power that Japan is, having the power to, well, at least economically, to block or hinder or bring into question some of the geopolitical decisions that the United States would make. And my question would be this. How would you balance out or make an assessment of the friendly intelligence requirements that we're going to have on Germany and Japan against the Soviet Union, which seems to be, or in some part, moving toward a democratization of the system over there?
Well, as long as the Soviet Union has many hundreds of nuclear weapons aimed at us, it's going to be a major problem for us to know what those are and what the situation is, what forces there are. Increasingly, we'll be able to answer that question not by spying and not by even satellite photography, but by going and looking with the full approval of the Soviets. But the analytical job of determining what is going on in the Soviet Union will still be a very important task for our analysts in intelligence, even if it isn't a problem for our collectors. With respect to Germany and Japan, we're going to be very attentive to the economic power that they represent. I think, my own self, that they will be allied with us in this new development of the world economy, with the 3 centers of East Asia, Europe, and North America, and that those 3 will have to work together and work cooperatively to improve the economies of the rest of the world, and to, incidentally, improve their own economy in terms of the sales of the products that they will be producing. So, yes, there's an intelligence target, but it doesn't mean spying. It means looking at what the facts are, analyzing them, coming out to some assessment of what they really mean.
William E. Colby is presently an attorney with the law firm of Donovan, Leisure, Newton, and Irvine. What areas of law are you practicing now?
Oh, I do mostly international questions of some sort.
Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Bend, Oregon. Go right ahead with your question or comment.
Mr. Colby, I haven't talked to you since I had dinner with you in Baklou, Vietnam a few years back. And
That was a few years back.
If we had have continued with the CIA and Special Forces concept, do you think we could have eventually won that war without the enormous casualties we built up later?
I think we could have if we had not overthrown President Diem in 1963. I think that the things were going quite well in 1962. But then we got diverted off into that overthrow of the president, and I think it was the biggest mistake we really made there, because the over-militarization followed it and was a result of the chaos that we had produced as a result of that overthrow. But even if the war had been lost, it would have been lost in 1965 by the Vietnamese, not by us. And really, if you have to say that Vietnam had to fall, the whole world would have been better off if it had fallen in 1965 instead of 1975.
William E. Colby, prior to spending 25 years with the CIA, served as a member of the staff at the American embassies in Stockholm, Rome, and Saigon. He was an attorney with the National Labor Relations Board prior to that, and was a graduate of Princeton University in 1940, where he graduated Phi Beta Kappa. Also received his LLB from the University of Columbia Law School. Let's go back to the phones. Washington, D.C. Thanks for waiting. Go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Colby, do you think the conviction of Poindexter and North has to do anything with citizens' misperception and misunderstanding of the necessity of intelligence generally and in the United States in particular? Thank you.
No, I don't think so. I think the citizens' perception of intelligence is that we need it, that it's a dangerous activity and it has to be done. But I don't think the convictions here for activity outside the proper authority in all these cases, that's what they were convicted of, acting beyond their proper authority and concealing the matter from the Congress. That's not something that stems from a citizen's misperception.
Los Angeles, California. Go ahead.
Yeah, hello? I'm an attorney, and I have, and I mean this question in all seriousness, for the last 15 years I've been investigating UFO reports and talked with specifically military people who have had sightings and a little more serious encounters than that. Philip Agee, who was that former, I guess it was CIA agent, reported that there is within the CIA a super sensitive or a top secret cell or unit that is specifically dedicated to investigating and covering up UFO reports. My specific question is, has the CIA or is the CIA, to the best of your knowledge, investigated UFO reports in any alien contact?
About 20-odd years ago, in the late 60s, there was a general question about UFOs, and the Air Force was charged with the job of running all the stories down. The CIA had only a peripheral contact with it. It wasn't very closely connected. The conclusion was that they found several events that they really couldn't understand, that really defied explanation. But nonetheless, there was no positive indication that there were UFOs. At that point, the CIA dropped it, and when I became director, we were totally uninvolved in anything like that. Now, I can't speak for what's happened since that time, but I rather question any such statement as Agee's claim that we look into it in order to suppress it. That I just don't believe.
What are some of the more unusual areas of activity that the CIA is called upon to look into?
Well, sometimes you're asked to explain what's going on in some country, that you suddenly see some evidence. Is Mr. Gaddafi building a plant that builds poison gas? When he had a fire in it, was it a real fire or was it a fake fire to try to get us to believe that the thing was destroyed while it was still working? What kind of experiments is Mr. Saddam Hussein of Iraq conducting in poison gas? What kinds of missiles are being accumulated by some of the Middle Eastern countries? That's the kind of thing that the CIA looks into.
Daytona Beach. Go ahead.
We were talking about Iran. Now, I would think that Khomeini represented Iran. So when we sent arms, we did not send them to Iran, Khomeini. We sent them to an Ayatollah that was against communism. And then the communists were propping up their Ayatollah, who is in power now. I think, what is it, Johnny's something. And so I don't believe we actually sent arms to Iran, because we sent it to somebody that was at least against communism, who was our enemy. And did you ever read the book by General Walters, Silent Missions? He was Army Intelligence.
I did read it. He's a very, very fine officer, there's no question about it, and a very interesting book. But with respect to Iran, our government was dealing with what it believed to be the authorities in Iran, because we wanted to get them to use their influence to get our hostages free. That's what the objective of the operation was. And yes, we did send the missiles to those authorities in Iran.
Marin County, California. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. With all the satellite coverage that we have all over the world, isn't there some way to use these technologies to positively find out if there are live POWs in Vietnam, MIA people?
I'm sure that we use all the evidence we can, live reports, hearsay reports, comments by people who've come through Vietnam, and satellites to see if we can see inside of some of the prisons there and that sort of thing, to see where new prisons are being built and things of that nature. It is very hard to tell from several hundred miles up in space just whether a particular prison is a Vietnamese, is a Pole, is a Russian, or is an American. That's practically impossible to tell that.
Columbus, Ohio. Thanks for the call. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. There hadn't been too much said about covert activities. I'm concerned particularly about the situation in Afghanistan as to whether we're going to continue to support the Mujahideen, and if so, what is the justification for that? The people, the Mujahideen, are shelling the cities indiscriminately, killing civilians, and using our stingers to knock down civilian airliners and so forth. And I'm just wondering how this differs from terrorism, and whether our covert support of the Mujahideen is going to continue.
Well, remember that our covert support of the Mujahideen began to assist them to evict the Russian army from occupying their country. And that was the purpose, that the occupation of Iran by Soviet forces was such a shock to the international system that we decided that we should help the Afghans to try to get them out. 3 million Afghans went into exile to get away from the Russian army, and we recruited people in there who were brave enough to go and fight against the Russians. Now, the Russians largely have withdrawn, and what's going on now is an attempt to set up a negotiation between the puppet government installed by the Russians and the different Mujahideen factions. And that's quite a tangle to try to put all those together. That is what is going on now. The United Nations Secretary General is doing his best to bring the different parties together to negotiate a peaceful solution. Meanwhile, we have been supporting, I gather, I don't know the facts on this, we continued to support the side that we had started to support all along.
Las Cruces, New Mexico, you're the last caller. Go ahead. I'm sorry, let's try again. Las Cruces?
Yes, please.
Go right ahead. You're the last caller.
Yeah, okay. I would like to ask to get the opinion of Director Colby as to the role of the CIA in Africa in supporting corrupted and tyrannical regimes like Mobutu's regime, which is internationally infamous for glaring abuse of human rights.
Well, the CIA has supported various people around the world. I think all the investigations into CIA have shown that CIA only supported people when its government agreed that they should be supported. Now, in the case of Mr. Mobutu, the question we faced in the Congo, the then Congo, now Zaire, in the 1960s was whether the country would be run by a corrupt puppet of the Belgian mining interests or by a leftist allied with Moscow, and we didn't want either. And therefore, the choice made by our government, not by CIA, but the choice made by our government was to support a local leader from the army, Colonel Mobutu. Now, that may have not been the wisest thing in the long term, but it certainly was the best thing in the short term. In other situations, CIA has helped people to fight against communist governments there, suppressing their people. It has helped various others around the continent of Africa to be independent and be national.
I'm afraid that was the last call. We're out of time. I want to thank you for being with us. We've been visiting with William E. Colby, former director of the CIA, and I want to thank you for being with us, and thank you for your phone calls.